U.S. history, welcome back to class. Okay, today I'm hitting the third and final part of like my response video series for that Ask Me Anything post. So got a lot of good questions in today. Some of them will be pretty brief answers. So we're actually going to hit a few more questions, but it shouldn't take all that much longer because I'm going to be knocking a lot of them out pretty quick. If I didn't get to your question, don't be offended at all. I wasn't able to get to every single one of them, but we just kind of ran out of time. And there probably will be another short video or two that I'm going to release next week that would kind of correspond to the life advice stuff that I had posted here at the end of this week. So without any further delay, here we go. First question up for today was from Nathan Paddock out of my 7th hour class, and he asked me a couple different things. What's my favorite moment in teaching? What's my favorite class movie that I use in the course? And then what are some good and bad things from this past year of like pandemic remote schooling? So I'd say my favorite moment from teaching, I don't know that I have one specific favorite moment, but hands down, my favorite thing to do is like interactive discussion. So that kind of sucks this year that we didn't have a whole lot of that. There were some of you that I saw coming into class quite a bit, but the majority of you were working remote and I didn't really get to see it much this year. So I would say like the relationship piece and actually like sitting down and getting to know people and doing life advice. So that's some of my favorite stuff. I will say one funny moment that kind of stands out in my head that always makes me chuckle. If you may have caught this a little bit this year, but past years I've given students extra credit if they Photoshop me into an epic photograph from like American history. And anyway, Castle Picklesheimer, who graduated a few years back, he was a master at Photoshopping, and he put a black and white image of my face with 3 guys sitting in a trench in World War I, and they were like eating beans and stuff. And then bam, there's Taluki's face right in the middle of it. And anyway, I'll throw it up on my PowerPoint when I'm covering and doing that lecture and see if anybody ever notices it. And usually somebody does, like, hey, you're in there. Anyway, a few years back, and I won't name any names, but maybe not the brightest student that I've ever had, made a comment and was like, hey, like, you were in the war? Like, and obviously I was not in World War I. That was like 100 years ago. So, and I would have had to been old enough to get like drafted or actually go fight. But I played along with it and was like, yeah, man, I was in the war. And he's like, man, what was it like? And like totally buying into it. And all the other kids around him were like chuckling about it, but nobody really spilled the beans on it. And yeah, totally had some a very gullible freshman student believing that I was in World War I back in 1918 and how they were fighting, and yet I was still around teaching today in this modern era. So kind of a funny little moment. Favorite class movie? I think I really like pretty much everything that I show in class. Probably my favorite all-around story, man, it would be a toss-up between Cinderella Man and Saving Private Ryan. I love both of those movies. I like the stories. Now, Cinderella Man's based on actual events. Saving Private Ryan is not. But man, those are definitely on my top 5 favorite all-time movie list. So it really is cool for me that I get to incorporate them into the class that I'm teaching. Good and bad moments from this year. I'd say, well, the good stuff, I like that I've increased my, kind of technological savviness or knowledge. I like that I know how to like record videos and screencasts and really load stuff to YouTube pretty seamlessly now. I enjoy that or appreciate that I picked up a lot of tech skills and have that kind of tech skill set that I wouldn't have had in past years. And I think that'll benefit me moving forward. But like I've already kind of said, the number one thing that I hated from this year was that there just wasn't a lot of interactive like class discussions, or there was a news bowl game that I used to play quite a bit in class, kind of a current events trivia one. And obviously we didn't get to do that this year. So I miss that. I miss being able to do group assignments. I used to do a lot of group projects and assignments. Didn't really see any way that I could tie that in with most people being on remote. And yeah, a lot of negative stuff. And then the other thing is, man, a lot of kids are checked out and not completing the assignments. And it breaks my heart to give people E's or low grades, because typically most kids in my class would usually finish with an A and B. if you're just putting in a little bit of effort. And it was kind of rare to have somebody in class that failed. I maybe have one or two kids in any given class period out of 30 that would fail my class. And that breaks my heart to be failing more students this year just for not completing work. So that would be some of the bad stuff. Hopefully next year we'll incorporate some of the new good things and be somewhat back to normal. So maybe in the end, when the dust settles, education will be better off for it. That's my optimistic approach to it. So next question. Wyatt Van Riper asked me about Atari, what I know about Atari. And if you don't know what Atari is, that was like the very first home video game system. And I picked on him a little bit for asking me that one. I'm like, how old do you think I am? Because I'm 40, just turned 40 this year. And Atari was actually a little bit before my time. I remember my older cousins that are 10 years older than me, they had an Atari when it just came out. And I was still not even quite old enough. I was little, so I wasn't quite old enough to really play it or enjoy it. It was a pretty basic system. The first system that I got as a kid and really had a lot of fun playing was the original NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. But yeah, I don't have too much to say about that. I was never that big of a gamer, but Atari was a little bit before my time. That was kind of like a early 80s at-home gaming system. So it was pretty revolutionary at the time. And of course, those have come a long way in the last 30 years. Next question. Another student from my 7th hour, just like Wyatt, Emily Warner asked me, how many blacklisted people from the kind of the 1950s, that Joe McCarthy era, were actually communist spies? So if you remember that chunk of the course from maybe a few weeks ago, Joe McCarthy was a U.S. Senator from Minnesota, not looking good for his prospects for re-election. And before his re-election came up, he started making announcements out there that, I know that there are these communist spies out there. And back then, communists, like that was seen as like our arch enemy. It was in the height of the Cold War, and he ruined a lot of people's lives by blacklisting them and accusing them of being communists, whether they actually were or not. Honestly, I don't have a great answer for you there. One thing that often doesn't get covered, and maybe I didn't explain this good enough, some of the people he accused of being communist sympathizers or talking to the Russians almost certainly were. America and Russia were spying on each other. So, that was going on, and it's legitimate that there was some communist infiltration going on. But definitely he really blew up the claims and exaggerated a lot of it and didn't have the evidence to back it up. So sorry, Emily, I don't have a perfect answer for you there. That might be one of those things that's kind of lost to history, but we'd have to do a lot more digging to actually see how many of the claims he made were legit and weren't and were not legit. But no exact answer for you there, but definitely there was something to some of his claims, but a lot of it was way over exaggerated. Next up, another one from my 7th hour, John Warner. He asked me, what's the craziest, most absurd moment I can think of from U.S. history? Man, this one I racked my brain on. I was trying to come up with some really big, epic thing that would be kind of kooky and absurd. This one might be a little bit disappointing, and it's probably not some epically big event that really gets even covered in most history classes. But many of you know, if you were paying attention back in Q1, I love Teddy Roosevelt. He, even though he's probably not the most influential or even professional president in American history, he's my personal favorite. I don't know. He's just my hero. Something about him just kind of resonates with me, and I really like his style. And one thing that I just can't stop, I always have found just so absurd, and like I can't see any other president before or after him doing. He was big. He got the pool tables all taken out of the White House and had wrestling mats put in, and he would daily like train doing boxing, wrestling, and like judo and jujitsu and things like that. And one time, the story goes, a group of congressmen came in and wanted to discuss some law, some legislation that was about to get passed. And they had, their pressing concerns and a list of things they wanted to talk to the president about. And he's like, man, I can't talk until I've had my workout. And he made them all go, before he refused to discuss any policy with them. He wouldn't give them what they want at all, or even like acknowledge them, until they got changed into like workout clothes and actually did like a wrestling session with them. And the president was in there just beating up on some old congressman. And I'm always like, man, that's crazy and absurd. Some other absurd moments that I'll be real quick with, also in the Teddy Roosevelt era. I guess the White House was almost a zoo at the time. Like he was the first president in a long time to come in that had young kids, and he had a bunch of 4 boys, and they had mules and like dogs and like all kinds of animals. I think they had a badger or a raccoon like running around the White House, and I guess it was literally and metaphorically like a zoo when he was in there. Another kind of crazy one, if you remember President Andrew Jackson, who Jackson County's named after, and this would have been from back in Mr. Fry's curriculum. He was seen as a populist, like a man of the people. And when he won the presidency, he had actually almost been kind of cheated out of the presidency one election cycle before, and it was contested, and some shady deals went down where he didn't get it. Well, then the next time he overwhelmingly wins it, and he becomes president, even though he had a lot of political enemies. Anyway, he had a kegger at the White House, like literally a kegger, brought in many kegs of beer, and his supporters from out in the backwoods, which were like wilderness guys, you know what I mean, coming in from the frontier to support him. They had a raging kegger at the White House, and I guess it was a mess for like weeks afterwards, where they just trashed the place, got drunk, and had a wild old shindig. That seems like a crazy, absurd moment for me too. And then in more modern times, man, I think the whole Trump presidency was kind of borderline absurd. And some of you might take that as I'm dogging Trump or hate him. I'm really not taking a stand there one way or the other. I see the pros and cons. I see why he would appeal to people, and I see why he would put a lot of people off. But man, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, or really anybody, I think, through American history and generations past, if we would have had a president that would say the kind of things he said and be on social media, firing out tweets and, dogging celebrities and stuff, that would have just seemed totally unbelievable and absurd. So not making a political stand one way or the other, or for better or worse, but man, a lot of the things Trump did were kind of absurd. And he definitely broke the mold of what we think of as a, kind of a president who's very proper and always, says the politically correct thing. So some crazy stuff there. Nothing, anything specific I'm getting into, but just in general, kind of his demeanor and how he conducted himself. Next up, Matheson Hess from my second hour class asked me, what policy do you think affected, like if he said a court decision or a piece of legislation, what policy shift do you think had the biggest cultural impact on America and just changed the direction of history? Well, boy, there's some good ones there that we could get into. I would say if we're going to go way back to the beginning, the Three-Fifths Compromise, that was a big one that I think echoes throughout history. If you don't know what that is, that's when at the time of the American Revolution, essentially, the founding fathers are getting together and see if we could, people were loyal to their states back then. America was not at certain points, not even a nation yet, or a very new nation. So most people were they identified with what state they came from. And in order to bind the colonies together and actually create a nation, you had to marry together and join the northern states, which are free states and no slavery, and the southern states that did have it. So the Three-Fifths Compromise is the southern states essentially wanted to have their cake and eat it too. On the one hand, they wanted to say, the black people that are our slaves are farm equipment. We can do whatever we want to them. We can kill them if we want. We basically treat them like cattle or farm equipment. On the other hand, when it would come time to count the census and say how many people live in the state and determine how many congressional representatives you had, they wanted to count the slaves as people. And it's kind of like, hey, you got to argue one side or the other. Either they're property and human chattel and they're like farm equipment, or they're human beings. So anyway, the only way that they were going to be able to get all the states together was they reached the Three-Fifths Compromise, which essentially was a slave in the southern states would be counted as 3/5 of a person. What a ethical and moral, just, I don't know even what to say about it, but man, that seems so just dehumanizing and backwards today. But at the time, it was an important compromise that actually formed America. If you wouldn't have done that, we probably wouldn't have a unified United States, moving throughout history or today. So I think it was, on the one hand, a horrible thing. On the other hand, it did form the nation together. But of course, a huge ethical dilemma there. And, that reverberates throughout the Civil War and the civil rights movement. And we're still probably feeling the echoes of that policy decision today. Other big policy decisions, I would say, when Woodrow Wilson decided to commit America to World War I and we joined that foreign war, from that point on, America has always kind of intervened in political conflicts, and there was no real turning back from that. That really changed the course of American foreign policy, joining World War I. And then you can see the 100 years that follow that, we've gotten involved in a lot of conflicts around the world and have become more of some people would say, an imperialist power where we're influencing a lot of the world. And then the third one I'll give you, I guess I should have picked one, but I would say another really big one is the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. If you don't remember that from me covering it in quarter four, in a lot of ways, that kind of was a start point for the modern civil rights movement. And essentially that got rid of separate but equal. It said that in the southern states, you can't have black schools and white schools anymore. There's just public schools, and where you live, that's where you go. So I think that was a big shifting point, and it raised tensions in the South a lot, led to a lot of problems and animosity. But I think it started us on a better path. And then the end result, another huge piece of policy is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which that's about 10 years after, 10 years right on the dot after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So 10 years into the civil rights movement, that law said you can't discriminate against people based on gender, race, ethnicity, anything like that, the color of their skin. And then another one to throw in there, women's suffrage. That's a pretty big one. Enfranchising half of the population to vote. That's a pretty big one too that I shouldn't overlook. Last question I have from Tatum. And I actually don't have on there written down which hour she was from, but doesn't really matter here. Tatum Brown asked me, what were the geopolitical, big term there, implications of entering the Vietnam War? So I think that was the first war that became just hugely controversial. And it became more controversial as the war went on. More people started getting kind of cynical about government and negative. And you see this big rift developing within the country between the older generation and younger generation. I think it was huge implications there because America, in a lot of ways, before and since, has it kind of been the policeman of the world, and we go and intervene in conflicts. But I think from that time on, it's made intervening in foreign places and foreign wars like that and butting into like kind of other regions or countries' business, it's made people permanently more negative on that. And you go back to the wars prior to it, Korea, World War II, World War I, the Spanish-American War, all those other conflicts we covered in the beginning of the class, those were almost all overwhelmingly supported, and Americans thought, yes, we're going to do it, and we're doing our patriotic duty. But from Vietnam on, now wars are debated a lot more. It's become more controversial to intervene. So thanks to everybody that asked me questions. I hope you took something from it, and we do have a final Q&A post that's getting thrown up. This one will be optional, so you can answer it or not answer it. If you need a boost in your grade, I highly recommend you do. For anybody that responds to that one, I'll grade it pretty easy. I'm basically going to give you full credit. It's an end of the year gift. You have to give me something. Say more than one word, but give a response. And what I'm asking you on that Q&A is just respond to any of the things I covered in the Ask Me Anything, the 3 videos that I did. So you can respond to any of the students' comments and my take on it, and just tell me, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Where did I get it right? Where did I get it wrong? Just throw in and chime in your 2 cents. And that's kind of the best I can do for an interactive discussion, all things considered this year. All right. If I don't see you again, I'll probably have a few more short videos dropping, but have a great summer. Good luck on the exam. Love you guys, and hopefully I'll see you again face-to-face in my elective class somewhere down the road before you graduate from MC.